Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the first Stewardship Masterclass for 2026, focused on outcomes reporting. For those that I haven't met, my name is Jackson, and I'm the Director of the Aotearoa New Zealand Stewardship Code. So the focus of today's session is on outcomes reporting, which is an area that's becoming increasingly important as disclosure expectations are maturing around the world. This maturity is bringing increasing emphasis not just on what investors are doing, but on what difference those actions are actually making. That shift from activity to outcomes is where much of the challenge and opportunity now sits. Now, if you want to jump to the next slide, this is just a brief summary of our aim today, and there's a couple of key things. Firstly, we want to really clarify what effective outcomes reporting looks like in practice and how it can be structured in a way that is credible, balanced, and importantly, decision useful. Secondly, we want to create a space, particularly in the second half of this masterclass, where you all can discuss the practical challenges you're facing and how we can collectively lift the practice around outcomes reporting in the New Zealand market. To do that, this session is structured in two parts. The first 30 minutes are being recorded and will be publicly available. In that segment, we'll hear from EY on outcomes reporting more broadly, including what it is and common challenges. And then we'll hear from ACSI, Australia's Council for Superannuation Investors, on some examples of effective stewardship-related outcomes reporting. After that, we'll move into the signatory-only discussion under Chatham House rule, where we'll explore examples in more detail and work through a practical exercise together. If you want to go to the next slide, Noah, before we start, I'll just quickly introduce the speakers for today. So we're really pleased to partner with EY for this session, and I'd like to particularly thank Pip Best and her team for the leadership in shaping today's discussion and for sharing EY's insights on effective, defensible outcomes reporting. Pip brings deep experience across sustainability advice and reporting, so I'm really pleased to have you on the call today, Pip. And we're also really lucky to be joined by Hannah Armitage, ACSI's Research Manager. Hannah works closely with investors on stewardship and engagement practice, and her perspective on how outcomes are tracked, evidenced and communicated in practice will add a really important dimension to today's discussion. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide, and I'll hand over to Pip to give a quick summary of the agenda and today's content.
Thanks, Jackson. So just in the first session, we're actually going to run through really the theory behind outcomes measurement and reporting, some of the challenges in implementing the theory in practice, and then really approaches for balancing the theory and those challenges. And then I am passing to Hannah, who is going to provide some examples of outcomes reporting to really see how that balance is being managed within the sector. So that is what we'll take you through in this first session. We will go into collaborative activities to kind of put some of this theory in practice in the second session. So please bear with us if this is a little bit theoretical at the start, and we will try and put this into life in the second session. So if we jump to the next slide. Jackson, did you want to run through this slide in terms of just setting the scene?
Yeah, sure. Good idea. So, I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, those who are on the call. But when we're talking about, one of the reasons we're talking about outcomes reporting is because it's encouraged within the Stewardship Code. One of the principles, Principle 8, is focused on measuring and reporting. And so when we're talking about reporting on outcomes, it's an important aspect of demonstrating how investors are contributing towards achieving sustainable outcomes for the environment, society, and economy. And crucially here, what we're trying to help with this masterclass is to enable that demonstration that the impacts it has have the outcomes of those impacts that you have. And that's one of the things we're increasingly seeing in disclosures globally, is that activities are really important to describe, but also increasingly important to describe the outcomes of those activities, and ideally in ways that are tangible and measurable. And so that's hopefully what will enable you all to be more comfortable and confident in today, is understanding how to describe and articulate that next step of the activities that you're doing. What are the outcomes of those?
Thanks, Jackson. So that, with that in mind, we will delve into what really is outcomes measurement, and theoretically how you go about putting a framework together to measure outcomes. So if we jump to the next slide, Noah. Reporting on outcomes does start with this this theory called outcomes measurement, and really this theory translates what historically may have been reported and is potentially easier to report about what your activities are. And what the outputs of those activities might be in a reporting period, and trying to translate that into actually what outcomes do those activities and outputs drive, and then focusing that on the measurement of performance rather than it being about the activity and output. It's about what actually is the result of those actions. So for investors, this can include the outcomes experienced by society, by the investors within a fund that you may be managing, or your investment holdings from the companies that you invest in. So what are the actual outcomes that those companies deliver, and therefore you're financing the activities of. It can also be related to not just the outcomes of the companies that you may invest in themselves, but also the outcomes from the activities that you as an investment manager or an asset owner may drive from your responsible investment strategy, such as what outcomes are driven from shareholder voting, direct engagement you might have, any screening that you may overlay on your portfolios, and actually what are the outcomes from reporting on these things as well. So does actually reporting itself therefore drive more awareness or clarity that then actually leads to outcomes as well. So that is really, I guess, theoretically how it applies to investors. So we jump to the next slide, Noah. Now, really, outcomes measurement starts with something called the theory of change. Hopefully for most people on the call, this is a common or something that you've come across before, and some of you may know this in detail already, but we are just trying to, I guess, set the scene here and bring everybody's knowledge to the same point. So I'm just going to run through really what is the theory of change, what is the purpose of it, and why it really is the foundation of outcomes measurement. So a theory of change is something that hopefully every business, every entity in a way has either kind of actually put together, or if they haven't put it, theory of change, it's understood by the organisation that what they're doing drives some outputs and therefore some outcomes. And the theory of change really actually is just a way of trying to document this so you have a clear understanding really of how your activities drive what you're hoping to achieve. It's the foundation of outcomes measurement, because once you've put this together and you have a view on how your actions then drive the outcomes or that you're aiming to achieve, you then put a measurement framework behind this, and you start to really test your hypothesis of are you driving the outcomes you're hoping to, and you also therefore test the effectiveness and the efficiency of the activities that you're undertaking. So that's really the purpose of it, and it is very hard to measure outcomes unless you have a understanding of how your business believes it generates those outcomes. So it focuses on these 5 main areas that are just mentioned on this slide. And this I'm just going to run you through the theory of this. We do in practice see, I guess, some level of, I don't want to say shortcutting, but some balance of trying to manage the complexity of putting a comprehensive theory of change together and putting something that is kind of as meaningful as possible without being overcomplicated. So this is the full theory, and then in practice you might find that there is a shorter-hand version of this that is material to driving the outcomes you're trying to measure, that is not quite the whole theory itself. The theory goes along the lines of you list the different inputs that your business uses. So it uses people, it uses the experience of those people, it potentially uses tangible, actual inputs like commodities, etc. It undertakes some activity. Outside the fund management asset owner sphere, you may think of this as, if you're a manufacturing company, your actual kind of manufacturing process. And in that kind of theoretical context, you turn commodities through manufacturing into a refined product, so your output. And again, just following that logic of a company a manufacturing company that produces some finished product. The purpose really is that you don't just provide a finished product that has no use. It has a use, therefore people will buy it, and that use is the outcome then of what the buyer of the product experiences by using that product. And really, outcomes, when you think of it in the theoretical context, can be very different in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So in a theory of change, we actually try and identify these in terms of short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. And really potentially then we talk about kind of second-order impacts as well. So what does this the activity that you undertake really drive at maybe a societal level? I'll just quickly run us through an example that's probably more relevant than a manufacturer. So if we think of, say, the responsible investment strategy that a fund manager or asset owner may implement, you have the people that look after the responsible investment strategy as inputs. You have their knowledge, etc. as inputs. Generally, that's less important to highlight because it's not really fundamental to the measurement component. But then where it does get important is to list the activities that responsible investment strategy and those people undertake, and that could be things like your shareholder voting. It could be things like the engagement that you undertake with management and boards. It could be your screening processes. So it's the actual activities that are related to that, to the process. And in this case, we're talking about a responsible investment policy. Those activities, so you could say, I undertake X number of shareholder votes during a year, they potentially have no actual outcome. So really then you want to actually turn that activity into an output and then an outcome. So yes, we voted against or for X number of resolutions, or we engage with management, which again is the action. The output might be X number of companies agreed to undertake a specific action that we discussed. So that's your output. What is the actual kind of count or the number of things that these activities then generated? And if they generated nothing, then probably you've undertaken some activities without an output occurring. But then the outcome, again, is even the next stage on. So yes, you engaged with X number of the management or board of companies. A subset of that agreed to do something, but actually what outcome did that something generate? If it was nothing, like if we're talking about climate change and its emission reduction, and yes, they agreed to implement a strategic 1.5 degree target, in the short term, so maybe in the next year, you might see very little outcome from that because their emissions might stay the same. But hopefully then over the medium and longer term, you might actually start to see that the emissions of that organisation fall. And if you don't, then potentially again, this output of this agreed action potentially actually hasn't driven any real world outcomes. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense in terms of the theory of putting a theory of change together. And we will just delve into, I guess, really, again, the theoretical side of how you then start to put a measurement framework behind this. Okay, so this again, this is the theoretical approach for measuring outcomes. And we are basing this on what is called the social return on investment process. This is a very comprehensive framework for measuring outcomes. And you will most likely find, and we'll delve into after this, some of the challenges with implementing this in practice and how investment managers or asset owners actually have to balance some of these challenges and potentially develop a simplified version of this framework. But we do want to just introduce you to the concept at the start so you can understand where you may be making I guess simplifications and what those simplifications may lead to in terms of the measurement process. So step one is developing this theory of change, which we've just covered, so I'm not going to delve into that again, but it's about setting out how your actions, your activities drive outcomes. Step two is then really trying to identify the most material things within that framework, because every layer, everything you measure adds an extra layer of complexity. And so what you really want to do is really get, I guess, the biggest bang for your buck here. And so you want to focus on what activities drive and what outputs and outcomes drive the most impact. So you go through this process of really trying to nail down what is it that you're trying to measure and focusing on those areas. So again, let's take the responsible investment strategy example. It might be that actually you're really just focused on climate change again. I keep using climate change because it's probably the most well-known example and most mature example. So I guess I'm just referring to it because it's a little bit easier to kind of understand when we run through the examples for it. So it could be that you're just focused on that at the moment and you're just talking about your actions that are specific to that topic and the key actions that you undertake. You then technically have to develop this algorithm which converts your outputs, so on your activities, so again, engagement with management and boards, to an outcome. And there's key things that in theoretical terms, and if you wanted to get a SROI measure, so a social return on investment measure, if you wanted to report it, best practice would be to develop this approach of measurement to get it peer reviewed, and it would need to consider all these elements. Again, in practice, you'll find that most people will find a simplified way of doing this, but we want to take you through the process. So to develop this algorithm, you need to consider a couple of things. You first of all need to find some kind of proxy that converts your activity to its outcome. I'll use a very familiar example, the most mature and easiest to use, so it gets harder and harder from this point, but we can use what is the outcome from producing a greenhouse gas emission. And we might use the social cost of carbon. That is, I guess, a well-known number that quantifies the health impacts, the societal impacts of a greenhouse gas emission, and it converts it to what the actual impact of that emission might be. So we might say, okay, a company has X number of emissions. We want to convert that to an actual cost on society, and we're going to use the social cost of carbon. But you then need to work out, how are you influencing that level of greenhouse gas emissions? And you have to then adjust for a couple of things. First is what we call dead weight. So regardless of your action, what would that company have done anyway? So would they have reduced their emissions if you hadn't engaged with them? Or would you expect them to increase? So what is the kind of counterfactual really of what would have happened should there have been no action from yourself? Attribution. So how much of any change, so if management does agree to something that you've asked them to do, say set 1.5 degree target, how much was your engagement with them contributing to them agreeing to that action? And we call that attribution. And then finally, drop off. And really drop off is you can measure things in the short term. So yes, we may, someone commits to 1.5 degree target. We then can see what we think the value of that is in the short term, but we might find that the impact of that change is diminished over time, because generally that is when you have an intervention, generally the impact of that intervention does drop off over time. So conceptually, they're the kind of adjustments that you need to consider when you're trying to make a claim of how your activities or outputs convert to an outcome or an impact. That is the theory. And we will, in the next slide, just go to some of the challenges of implementing the theory. Oh, no, sorry. We're just going to give you some examples of what we mean here, and then we'll go into some of the challenges and practicalities of implementing that theory. So we just wanted to give you some examples of what we mean in practice when we're thinking about converting the activities into a measurement of outcomes. We've tried to, again, make this relevant to a investment manager or asset owner. So you may convert the number of meetings you have with management on a specific topic to the actual agreed actions from that meeting. Again, we've used the 1.5 degree target example. It might be that in the short term, they're just agreeing to the target. It might be in the medium term, they make some strategic changes to their business. And it might be in the long term that you see a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions potentially. And you can, that's why we try and distinguish that short, medium and long term, because they're actually very different outcomes that are experienced. It could be your activity is the voting, or the output might be the number of affirmative votes on a specific topic or negative votes. Again, what is the actual outcome from that voting process that happens from the company ideally making a change or an intervention based off the voting? How many collaborations have you been part of with other investors? So again, there's very frequently sector-led movements that have more outcome associated with them because if you work together, you generally have more power. So that in itself is generally an activity, and therefore, what is the outcome of those sector-led movements? Government policy submissions, what are the actual outcomes from you submitting to government or engaging with government on a specific topic? And again, another example here, which is the screening is the activity, but the outcomes from a screening is the outcome. So that's just to try and kind of put this in terms that I guess hopefully are tangible for everybody in the meeting. So go to the next slide. So this is where hopefully, sorry.
Could I just jump in with a question? And actually it might be a little bit of a Jackson question too. If we go back to the slide before, in terms of like reporting, this is really helpful, thank you. But in terms of reporting for us as Stewardship Code signatories, obviously it's much more concise to be reporting on the activities because you've just got, a whole bunch of numbers. When you're then trying to report on the outcomes, it's obviously on a case-by-case basis. You're then having to explain what the outcome is from each of those underlying activities, but we don't have the luxury of pages and pages of case studies. So is it the expectation that you're sort of giving the full picture of activities and then you're giving example outcomes where as much as you can, or are we trying to get to full reporting on the outcomes and we're not as interested in the activities? Probably more a Jackson question, sorry.
No, that's okay. And I'm happy to start. And Pip, I'd be interested in your general comments. And then also we can dive into this more deeply in the second half of the conversation as well. But from the code's perspective, I think reporting, we certainly encourage concise reporting. And with stewardship reports, we say they should be between 10 and 12 pages, for example. To do that, you absolutely need to prioritize, right? I think even from an activities perspective, you can't really disclose all of the activities. And instead, it's about what are the meaningful, important information to disclose for your stakeholders to describe the various aspects of stewardship within the stewardship code. I think that extends to outcomes, and yes, it certainly takes more words, and you'll see in some of the examples that outcomes disclosure does take a little bit more, but in terms of that meaningfulness, that's where I think it's really heightened with outcomes, and you need to prioritize. But then as you do prioritize and identify what is most meaningful for your stakeholders, that's where it gets, I think, more valuable in theory than simply an exhaustive summary even of the activity. So I agree that it's hard, and it's particularly when it is concise, but the value of the right prioritization and the right outcomes being disclosed should be greater than an exhaustive list of activities. Mm-hmm. Pip, I'm interested in your thoughts too.
Yeah, I think that unless Jackson says that the code has a specific answer on that, I think that is, I guess, the real challenge in this, which is that there isn't a prescribed answer, and actually the approach that you take, I guess I almost think about it in terms of optimizing the approach you take. Like, is it the approach that optimizes showing that there's actual outcomes from the work you're doing, and that is useful for many kind of actual strategic reasons. So rather than, I guess, showing that I think there's a question in the chat also about the value of reporting. So, I guess this is a really good one to talk about. Like, reporting itself potentially has a reputation of being an administrative heavy process. So there'd be lots of potential activities that you might identify associated with reporting. Now, if it doesn't lead to an outcome, it's increasingly going to be challenging to say that a business should continue to report. However, if we can show, or if you can show through a theory of change and a measurement process, that the reporting is potentially theoretically going to drive short, medium and long-term outcomes, and there's ideally a way to measure those, then hopefully there's an evidence base to show that those activities are driving outcomes. And if there isn't, then again, it probably leads to a very sensible question about, is there any value in undertaking that activity? I say that theoretically, it is challenging to measure the outcomes from reporting. And the key challenge with outcomes, again, is that you can measure short-term outcomes. Number of companies that report is, say, an output. The outcome might be any actual short-term challenges, shareholder activism, investor activism, comparability, commitments of the company from that short-term reporting. Medium term, hopefully there's a more significant step change, and then long-term, ideally, it's driving the purpose of the reporting in it theoretically. The challenge then is that because the short-term outcomes potentially don't show the full benefits, you can find, I think we would all be very familiar with what's going on with climate reporting, that there's a lot of questions about the value of the reporting in the first place, or how to kind of get the biggest bang for buck in that reporting in itself. Because there's lots more questions. But this is actually the focus of the rest of the session and the session afterwards, which is trying to find the right balance between moving towards outcomes, but not overcomplicating your reporting to lose a reader, or to overclaim something. Really are the two real challenges. So I don't know if we'll go to the questions now and then keep going. So
yeah, I might just jump in. Grace and Paul, if your questions are burning, do please ask them now. But otherwise, let's finish this initial content, and then we can get into the Chatham House piece.
Okay, we'll jump to the next slide. So again, this is based on the theory. The rest of the session we'll try and focus on putting this into practice and addressing the key challenge we've just discussed, which is how you go far without overcomplicating or overclaiming. So the challenges in reality of implementing the full kind of social return on investment theory is, first of all, how you measure attribution. It's very challenging to isolate, particularly for an investment manager or a asset owner, to isolate your actual contribution or attribution to an actual outcome. You'll see in the following sessions, we do talk about how you can qualitatively describe some of these limitations. So you're not overclaiming, but you're also not overcomplicating your actual disclosure and the measurement. The value of outcomes depends on personal preferences. So when you really get into the theory of outcomes measurement, how much someone values an actual outcome generally depends on that person. Because a lot of it does come down to the societal value of something. And so that also in itself is very challenging to measure. So again, we tend to find that we make a lot of simplifications to avoid trying to measure kind of personal preferences. So again, social return on carbon is one way that there's been a lot of research and academic studies to pull that number together. It won't reflect the value of a greenhouse gas emission to every person, but it is ideally an evidence-based approach that tries to simplify that challenge. Balancing complexity with usefulness. This is really what we're spending the rest of the session talking about. So generally you will find that when you do undertake outcomes and measurement, there is a simplified way of putting a theory of change and measurement framework together. The transparency of no or negative outcomes. So generally you'll find outcomes reporting focuses on how the company does drive all these outcomes from their actions, because otherwise what is the purpose of what they're doing? That is a challenge, but ideally, strategically, this can also identify areas where there may be an activity that is not driving an outcome that should be something for an organisation to focus on. It is challenging, though, to then see that integrated into reporting. And finally, reporting without linking to the opportunities. So this is really just where you do report on the actual activities. You we'll find over time there might be increasing challenges about like, is that actually adding value to what you're trying to do, which is again is the real purpose of outcomes reporting. So we'll jump to, I think, the last slide. I'm going to run through this quite quickly because I feel like we've talked about a lot of these points, and we're going to focus on them in the hopefully the more engaging collaborative sessions that are coming up. But really, you want to prioritize the areas that you most want to measure, because again, we want to keep this concise. We want to keep it meaningful. You want to focus on really what is your contribution attribution, but that may be through a qualitative disclaimer. So you're not overclaiming, but also these things are challenging to measure. So there are, again, those ways of trying to balance those two pieces. Do be careful about distinguishing between long, medium, and short-term outcomes, because they can be very different. Shorter is generally easier to measure, and therefore what more commonly is measured. However, ideally, you at least have an understanding of how that might drive the more significant shift in the long term. Ideally, you want to use evidence-based ways to measure this as this type of measurement matures. So take greenhouse gas emissions reporting. Again, climate change is the most obvious topic to pick, so sorry for keep choosing it. You will find that it becomes increasingly necessary to use evidence-based approaches, because comparability becomes increasingly important, and things like assurance will increasingly be the focus of these types of reports. So ideally, you want your approach to be evidence-based, and if not, you do want clear disclaimers around where you're making assumptions or estimates. And finally, just making sure again that this is based off that theory of change process, and that if you are measuring something, ideally you can repeat that process year on year, so you can collect the evidence to show that there is a change occurring. I think that's just the end of the theory discussion, so hopefully everybody's still here. And I'm passing to Hannah just to go through a couple of examples of outcomes reporting in practice.
Great, thanks very much. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Armitage, and I work at the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, as Jackson mentioned. In case you don't know us, we're actually a member organisation based in Australia, and I'll be taking us through a couple of slides. This is a mix of our own reporting as ACSI and reporting done by some of our members. Just to clarify, these are extracts, so I'm not trying to imply that this is exactly how people should be reporting, but they're kind of interesting extracts that act as examples for how some of these things can come to life. So the first thing that I would say is the two examples on the left are both ACSI examples, and the one on the right is from a member of ours, UniSuper. I think the first thing to note is that actually the fact that there is an ability to cross-refer is quite helpful with the question of attribution. A number of the examples that we'll go through, I think, cover that issue relatively well in terms of putting within the context, putting the example and the statement within the context of, for example, wider shareholder dissatisfaction, or the fact that other groups on a collaborative basis are talking about the same issues. So it puts within context the work that the individual investor or indeed organisation is doing. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is how these examples come together, and they're really focused on remuneration. Australia has a pretty specific remuneration approach, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, where we have an advisory non-binding vote on the remuneration report. If there is a specific level of vote against that remuneration report, there is a second resolution which allows investors to vote on a board spill. So it's called the two strikes approach in Australia. One of the things that is quite interesting in the two strikes context is that it's actually been around now for 15 years. And the way that you'll see a lot of people talk about it does bring out this question of sort of the short term and the longer term. When our members, and indeed ACSI in our own engagement report, are talking about remuneration, we're often saying, this is what we've seen this year. These companies had a strike. These companies had a vote against. This is what it looks like. We've seen these kind of good or poor practices in short-term incentives and long-term incentives. And that kind of quite short-term focus on the season that was, really. But remuneration is one that, as I say, given two strikes, has been around for 15 years. There is increasingly disclosure by ACSI and others around the market-wide effects of that regulatory change that was supported by ACSI and our members. So we've seen a real moderation of some examples of CEO pay in Australia in comparison to international jurisdictions. Doesn't mean there aren't ongoing remuneration issues, of course, but that public policy aspect of the support that was provided for two strikes, the ongoing support that we provide in the market for it, the conversations that has driven, and then the individual examples that we see where investor ire is reflected within votes, builds quite a compelling argument for wide change, for the fact that public policy outcomes can have a really important effect on that company behavior, the investor behavior, and the fact that we see less of an unequal pay outcome result on a market-wide basis. It's also not just ACSI saying this. Because of that public policy aspect, there's quite a lot of commentary around it more broadly, which is obviously also quite helpful to tie in the work that we and others do on this. On the example at the top, that's actually a specific example from our engagement report that came out in June last year. And I just wanted to bring that up because whilst it doesn't provide the context of what improvement looks like and the outcomes that have resulted, it is quite a good example of the fact that to be clear about outcomes, you first have to be clear about what you're actually trying to achieve. So we have we continue to improve the structures that we put in place and to work to be clearer about what we expect the changes that we want to see companies make, and the changes obviously that will, or the outcomes and impacts that will have on a wider basis. But we need to be clear about that in order to understand if an outcome has indeed been achieved. And also, as you can see in the statistics that we have there, we have both companies that we talk to, but also a set of what we call our priority companies. And you can see that on remuneration, we had 52% of priority companies make an improvement, which essentially means they moved towards doing something that we wanted them to do or made a change that we were expecting. Progress is not always linear. And I think that sometimes things like we had this many meetings is a helpful statistic on the activities, but actually whilst this is a statistic, it does bring out a bit more of the flavour of the fact that things are not, you don't always get the outcome that you seek, but it doesn't mean it isn't worth having that conversation and seeing if you can move or move in the right direction. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. This is an example from one of our members, UniSuper, and it brings together some of their reporting around remuneration in the context of Cleanaway. This is a case study that they included in their stewardship report from last year. I think some of the things that are interesting about this example in blue is that it's quite clear about the conversations that UniSuper has had with Cleanaway on an ongoing basis. It explains the topics that have been the focus of that ongoing engagement. And in the context of attribution, it's really showing what progress has been made, but also trying to show in some of the other reporting, it talks about the fact that there is quite widespread shareholder dissatisfaction, particularly around the remuneration report. It mentions, for example, that UniSuper itself voted for the remuneration, the 2025 AGM, but in fact the wider shareholder result was a vote of 41% against, which resulted in a strike. So showing that there is a wider context of shareholder dissatisfaction is quite helpful in building the context of the discussions that they're having, the ongoing engagement, the fact that they haven't necessarily seen the progress that they were hoping to see, but equally the actions that Cleanaway itself has had, that UniSuper itself has taken. One individual investor is never going to be the answer, but I think the clarity of what was discussed and the changes that have been made helps build the picture of the fact that UniSuper has been part of that process without needing to say, we think we had this effect, or we think we were, 5% of the reason why they did this. If you provide a case study, you can build out some of that, I guess, more persuasive qualitative evidence without having to actually say exactly what your specific role might have been, because it provides that clarity about exactly what was done. I think also in this example, it's interesting to see that it provides some insight into what they're satisfied with and what they remain unsatisfied with. And I think that's something that can be quite helpful in outcomes reporting, because, as I said, things aren't always linear and we won't always see the improvement that we're seeking. So obviously, when we're talking about safety and the challenges around safety, we really want to see a company being accountable. We want to see that remuneration structures are making those people be accountable, that there is governance, risk and oversight, that there's an appropriate risk management framework around these issues. And of course, over time, that there is a safety record that shows that these issues have been taken seriously and are being considered appropriately by the company. So bringing all of that together, I think a few things that I would raise around outcomes reporting. And as I said, none of this reporting is perfect. I don't want to claim that we have absolutely nailed it, but I think that putting the reporting that is provided into the context of what is happening in the market is really helpful and provides a real risk mitigation against any issues around attribution or the conversations that people are having. I think public policy outcomes over the long term can be actually really helpful to point to. They are much, much harder to point to in the short term because a lot of those public policy questions take quite a long time to flow through, but actions around public policy submissions and the public policy settings can have a really, really significant impact over the long term. And it can be something that can be quite helpful to refer back to when we're thinking about what is the impact that our activities have had, both on a company specific basis and that wider systemic change. And then obviously over time, hopefully, on things like remuneration or safety, we will see the outcomes that we all seek, including remuneration more effectively tied to appropriate incentives, moderated where that is appropriate, and appropriate safety records that show that safety is being taken seriously and we're seeing fewer fatalities and fewer safety incidents at companies where that's relevant. So we don't necessarily always see those longer term outcomes, but hopefully over time we do, and we can tie those individual discussions that we have with companies, wider public policy and wider societal impacts. So that's all I was going to go through on those examples, and I'll hand back to Jackson to take us into the next session.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Hannah and Pip, for the both very informative presentations. That concludes the public session of this masterclass. So thank you very much, everyone who's watched the session. We're now going to transition to that signatory-only Chatham House conversation, which means we'll stop the recording. For those of you who are watching the recording, if you'd like to discuss any of this further, please feel free to contact the Stewardship Code via our website, and always happy to discuss this more. And for those on call, please stay on the line and we'll continue in a moment. Thanks, everyone.